I'm a geneticist and an anthropologist. I've studied people all over the world. I've traveled to about 75, 80 countries at this point, using DNA as a tool to try and piece together how people are related to each other, how we explain the patterns of human diversity we see around the world. And the story in our DNA tells a story of a species that originated in Africa within the last 200,000 years and only started to venture forth from Africa within the last 60,000 years or so, populating the world and in the process generating those patterns of diversity. In our studies of these ancient human migrations, we make use of DNA as a historical tool, as a document, as a piece of baggage that gets carried along for the ride on these great epic voyages. But in fact, DNA is a lot more than that. It's a dynamic molecule, and it's changing along the way. It's not only changing in these random ways that allow us to track migrations, but it's also changing in response to the environments that people live in. And in fact, we can study how people have adapted to the environments that they live in. Which brings us to the first thing I want to talk about, the first section of the book, a chapter I call Mystery in the Map. When the Human Genome Sequence, the draft, was announced back in 2000, Bill Clinton called it the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind. But of course, as Alfred Korzybski tells us, a map is not just the territory that it represents. Sometimes it's far more than that. Recently, as the tools of genetics have advanced, and they've advanced very, very rapidly as a result of the Human Genome Project, people have been able to look across the entire human genome, all 6 billion letters in the human genome, and ask questions about how our DNA has adapted as we've moved around the world. And there have been some epic studies that have come out in the last few years, this being the first. A paper that was published back in March of 2006, spearheaded by Jonathan Pritchard, a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, where he looked at the patterns of selection in the human genome. Now, a little bit of technical detail on how he did this. This is your genome, so it's the 6 billion letters of code, the A, C, G, and T, and the famous double helix, but arranged into these pairs of chromosomes. There are 23 pairs of them. You get one from your mother, one from your father. They're not identical to each other. They're slightly flawed copies based on the accumulation of random changes that have occurred over time as the DNA is being copied and passed down through the generations. We call these single nucleotide polymorphisms, and they define the background level of variation in the human genome. So you've got 2 chromosomes in each pair, which are slightly different from each other. But they're different not only because of these mutational changes that have occurred, but also due to a process known as recombination, a shuffling that's occurred in every generation. And this actually takes one piece of a chromosome and attaches it to another, a bit like shuffling a deck of cards, all along their length. And if you look back in time, from your chromosomes back through the generations, you can see that what you have today, these highly shuffled chromosomes, ultimately trace back to individuals in the past like that. But the idea is that looking at chromosomes in any population today, you, the other people sitting in the room, the rest of Europe, people in Africa, there is an average length to these unshuffled regions in the people in that population. And that's the tool that Pritchard used to start to piece together these signals of selection. They're kind of like beads on a string. So if you think about your chromosomes as being like multicolored beads on a long string, in any section of the chromosome you expect some random pattern of beads, but occasionally what you're going to find on these chromosomes is sections that seem to be too similar to each other over a long space. So in this case, it's as though you've had a little section of bead that's been copied and passed around through many people in the population. They've liked the way it looks on your necklace, and they've decided, I'm going to copy that. It's like a fashion accessory. Except when this happens at the DNA level, it's not fashion, it's selection that produces that. What has happened is that natural selection has caused some gene, some genetic variant sitting in this region to increase in frequency. And it's by recognizing these regions that we can recognize past episodes of selection in the human genome. But when you look at where these episodes of selection are occurring, they tend to occur at very interesting places. In fact, the strongest signal of selection we see in the human genome is at the lactase gene. What does lactase do? Lactase is the enzyme which allows babies to metabolize lactose, the sugar in milk. And since all babies, or males, come out drinking milk, every baby that's born has a functioning version of the lactase gene. Now, most babies, as they develop, get a little bit older and are eventually weaned off of the milk, lose the ability to digest lactose. The lactase gene becomes inactive. In some populations, though, particularly populations that drink a lot of milk, those that domesticated goats and sheep and cattle over the last 10,000 years, they have retained the ability to digest lactose into the adult stage. So they don't lose the lactase gene as they get older. They retain that ability all the way into adulthood. What's interesting is, if you look at where these regions that have experienced strong selection are found, and more importantly, the timing of these selection events, the majority of the strong selective events in the human genome, again, this is a shotgun approach, there's no particular hypothesis, looking for these regions that are shared among many chromosomes. The fascinating thing that comes out of it is that all of these regions were selected strongly in the last 10,000 years. Lactase is a good example. We changed our culture to develop milk drinking. We domesticated the animals that allow us to drink milk, and that actually caused a change in us. It looks like that's happened all over the genome in the last 10,000 years. So what happened 10,000 years ago? Well, it's something I call the Big Bang. What you're looking at here is a photograph from the early 1950s of the excavation of the city of Jericho by Dame Kathleen Kenyon. And this gentleman at the bottom is standing at 10,000 years ago. And of course, all of what we think of as human history, civilization, has accumulated above him. By looking at certain key sites, Jericho is a good example, of course. Abu Huraira is an even better one, a site in northern Syria on the Euphrates River. We've been able to piece together why people made this sharp transition into developing agriculture around 10,000 years ago. To get at the ultimate reason why we developed agriculture, we need to leave aside archaeology and genetics for a minute and think about the weather. When all else fails, talk about the weather. What was going on around 10,000 years ago? Often climate is a clue as to why people are doing things, certainly these migratory events that I study in my day job, if you will. Well, the thing I want you to look at in this is something called the eccentricity graph. This is a measure of the extent to which the Earth's orbit around the sun is either circular or elliptical. And it goes through phases where it's more circular and phases where it's more elliptical. And as it goes through these, it changes the Earth's climate. And what's interesting is that when it goes through the very elliptical phases, we go into an ice age. And when it becomes more circular, we move out of the ice age into an interglacial period. So we entered the last ice age between 120 and 110,000 years ago. Things started getting really bad about 70,000 years ago. And they got worse and worse and worse until we hit the last glacial maximum, roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago. Massive ice sheets covering most of the northern hemisphere at that time. But the one that I want you to look at and pay most attention to is the one that was covering the majority of North America at that time. It's known as the Laurentide ice sheet. Massive, massive pile of ice, one of the largest that's ever existed. Now, as we were coming out of this elliptical phase and starting to become more circular in our rotation around the sun, and things were warming up, what happened? The climate started to warm, the ice sheet started to melt, and it melted quite a bit, starting around 15,000 years ago. The conditions were improving, the weather was getting better, and the ice, of course, being water, had to go somewhere, so it became a lake. In fact, the largest lake that's existed in the last couple of million years, Lake Agassiz. It was larger than the state of California in terms of surface area. It's about 1.5, nearly 2 times as large as Britain. So massive, massive body of water, held back by the remnants of the Laurentide ice sheet, by a few little bits of ice and glacial moraine and at the end, holding this massive body of water in. The temperatures continue to increase, and at some point, around 12,500 years ago, finally this ice dam bursts. Boom. All the water flows out, the majority of it flowing out of the St. Lawrence River into the North Atlantic. When it does that, since fresh water is less dense than salt water, it flows out over the surface of the North Atlantic up here, killing something known as the thermohaline current, the Gulf Stream, the thing that allows Cornwall to maintain coconut palms and so on today, that keeps the climate of parts of Northern Europe much warmer than they should be for their latitude. So Cornwall is actually the same latitude as Manitoba in Canada, which is extremely cold, much colder than Cornwall itself is. What happens when you get this layer of fresh water overlaying over the North Atlantic is that you kill this thermohaline current, and the Northern Hemisphere, which had been coming out of the Ice Age, suddenly plunged back in. It was a period of much colder climate, Ice Age-like climate that lasted for over 1,000 years, known as the Younger Dryas. So if this is what Eurasia and Africa would have looked like during the last glacial maximum, roughly 17,000 years ago, you can see lots of desert everywhere, because what actually tends to happen in the tropics, at least, when you go through these Ice Age periods, is they dry out in addition to becoming cooler. We were headed toward this, the Holocene optimum, which actually occurred around 7,000 years ago. Populations started to expand as a result of that. People settled down and started relying on particular food sources in places like Abu Huraira, which I mentioned before, and Jericho, a group of hunter-gatherers, which is how we had lived for the entirety of our history as hominids, hunting and gathering, finding food where we could get it. A group of people known as the Natufians, a hunter-gatherer culture in the Middle East, started focusing entirely on collecting grains, which became very widespread, much more abundant around that time, during this interglacial period. Then unfortunately, that ice dam bursts, and we're plunged back into glacial conditions. The problem for the Natufians, though, is that they had already increased their population size enough so that they couldn't go back to being nomadic hunter-gatherers, relying on the natural stands of grain. There was a food crisis. Populations that had started to grow at the end of the last ice age were forced to innovate during the Younger Dryas in order to have enough food. And the result, of course, was agriculture. So we know about this best from work that's been done in the Middle East, but this happened simultaneously, roughly, within 1,000 or 2 years, at lots of places around the world. So we've got the development of rice agriculture in East and Southeast Asia, banana and taro agriculture in the highlands of New Guinea, potato-based agriculture in the Andes, and maize or corn agriculture in the highlands of Oaxaca, all happening around the same time, all due to this climatic crisis, this plunge back into the last ice age. Necessity is the mother of invention, one of the themes that I explore many times in the book. Now, agriculture is not simply planting seeds. Of course, it's modifying them to be something that we can make use of. It provides more food for us, or they're easier to harvest, or they last longer, whatever it might be. Best example, probably the development of corn, maize, from this ancestor, teosinte, which looks hardly anything like it. And in fact, botanists still debate to this day whether that really is the proper wild ancestor of domesticated corn. It seems likely that it is. But you can imagine the thousands of years of effort, intense effort, that were involved in producing what we think of as maize today from that stubbly little thing over there on the left. And as a way to get an insight into this, I, in the second chapter of the book, go to a fish farm and talk to people on the cutting edge of aquaculture in Norway about what they're doing to domesticate species today, because this really is the cutting edge of agriculture. Fishing, certainly oceanic fishing, is really the only realm of food production in the world where we're still hunter-gatherers. But, as we've all heard, of course, from reading the newspaper and other sources, the state of the world's fisheries is not good. And we are currently in a crisis point there where we're having to develop aquaculture. So I gained an insight into that by visiting some of these aquaculture research facilities. Now, the end result of producing more food was that after we came out of that Younger Dryas period, and the climate actually did start to move back toward the Holocene optimum, which I showed you 7,000 years ago, after we get out of the Younger Dryas phase, the population literally explodes. So a population that had been expanding slowly as we migrated around the world over the last 50,000 years, suddenly took off. And we're up to 6.8 billion today, increasing by the middle of this century to perhaps 9.5, 10 billion, at which point we'll probably plateau, and possibly the population will even start to decrease. Now, with that increase in population, and the fact that 99.99% of the people in the world today are agriculturalists rather than hunter-gatherers, surely it's a truism that agriculture was good for us. It was a way of saving ourselves during the Younger Dryas period, coming out of the last ice age, but it must be, all joy and light, happiness and light. In fact, it wasn't. Even in the very early days of agriculture, it was very clear that it wasn't that good for us, perhaps surprisingly, given its success. And the best way of looking at this is to look at archaeological material both before and after the agricultural transition and look at several key measures of how healthy people were, including longevity, height, which is very closely associated with the quality of your diet, something known as the pelvic inlet depth index, which is also highly correlated with the quality of your diet. And what you see is that this is a transect, very famous study done by Lawrence Angel, an anthropologist back in the 1980s. If you look through time across this transition to agriculture, from the Paleolithic hunter-gatherers up into the Mesolithic, which is the early stage just of the development of agriculture, early Neolithic moving forward, you see that all of the measures of health actually decrease as we're going through this transition, which is kind of shocking. If anything, people should have been healthier because there was more food, but in fact, they were less healthy. So why did they win out? Well, of course, it's because you could grow more people, but there were knock-on effects from this. Massive shifts in diet Now, I talk in one of the chapters about the disease burden, the development of civilization. So, given that we see a change in the physiology, and people seem to be less healthy, and I trace some of the results of that in the chapter, what were people dying of before? Okay, when they were very, very healthy. In fact, Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, if you look at the stature and you look at the all sorts of other measures of how healthy they were, seem to have been healthier than we are today, even in the modern world. So what were they actually dying of back in those days? Did they live forever? No. They were probably dying largely of trauma. That's the best thinking. So people were out hunting and they would break their leg or something and it would become infected, or they would get into a skirmish with another group perhaps. But that seems to have been the major cause of death. What shifted once we developed agriculture and started to increase the number of people was that the disease burden changed from trauma to communicable disease, infectious disease, because we had a dense enough population that people could actually transmit the disease and you could maintain an infection in the population. But also, most importantly, we domesticated animals. Okay? And animals carry all sorts of nasty diseases, zoonotic diseases, as they're called, smallpox, measles, originally rinderpest in cattle, and of course malaria, which had probably been around for a very long time, but expanded its range massively around the time we developed agriculture. Most of the world's communicable diseases, and certainly all of the major communicable diseases, trace back to the development of agriculture. And many of them came in from the animals that we domesticated in the last 10,000 years. So we see that shift, that wave, where trauma starts to decrease, but communicable disease starts to increase. Then we move into the 20th century. We develop modern methods of medicine, vaccinations, and so on. Communicable disease, at least in the Western world, starts to decrease, but we see a concomitant increase in non-communicable disease, chronic disease. And this is largely as a result of the shift in diet, which traces back to, again, the Neolithic period. So if we look at these people with Abu Huraira, the Natufians, the hunter-gatherers who were gathering all the grain there, look back to around 12,000 BCE. They're consuming about 150 different plant species. They have an incredibly diverse diet. They rely on a lot of different sources for their calories. We go through that Neolithic transition, and around 8,000 BC, we're down to about 8 species at places like Abu Huraira. And in fact, most of the calories people are consuming are coming from just 2, wheat and barley. A massive shift in diet. And in fact, today, the majority of the world's calories come from just 3 species of plant. Starch-rich species of plant. Wheat, corn, and rice. In fact, over 90% of the grain calories consumed in the world today come from these 3 species. Now, one of the problems with increasing the starch content in your diet like that is that you tend to develop things like this, cavities. That is a cavity, and it dates not from this century or last century or a few centuries ago, but in fact from perhaps as much as 9,000 years ago. It comes from a place called Mehrgarh in Pakistan. It's the oldest Neolithic settlement in southern Asia. And that hole you see, a round hole right there, was actually produced by this, a dentist drill. This is during the Neolithic. That's a stone tip. And people are rotating that with a little bow. Up to 1,000 RPM would have been incredibly painful, but apparently not as painful as the cavity itself. This is a shift that we see all over the world. We see this in North America as well. If you look at the hunter-gatherer populations, they have hardly any cavities in their teeth, and then as soon as agriculture appears, it shoots up. You get 5 times as many. This shift in diet, already, very early on, this is long before today's obesity epidemic, the diabetes epidemic we're all talking about now. Very early on, we can see that our biology seems to be mismatched with the new diet and the new culture we've created. And of course, today, things are playing out. They continue to play out. The incidence of obesity having increased about tenfold in the last century or so. This is a study that was done by an economist, a health economist at the University of Chicago about a decade ago, where he looked at Civil War veterans who, in order to get their pension benefits, came in and they were weighed and all sorts of metrics were written down on them. And he took those individuals and compared them to men living in the United States in the latter part of the 20th century. And you can see that basically in every age group, you see a massive increase in obesity. And that number has in fact gone up in the last decade. So this shift in diet, the shift in culture continuing to play out on our physiology. In fact, every major disease that afflicts humanity today has its roots in the Neolithic transition. And in fact, that's how this book really started. everybody, I think, has heard about all of these changes that are taking place today, the increase in obesity, and increase in diabetes, and so on. And I kept asking, well, what caused that, and what caused that? And you go far enough back, and it all seems to lead back to the Neolithic transition. There wasn't, though, simply a biological fallout or a physiological fallout from this shift in agriculture or shift in subsistence. There was also a mental fallout. This is the way we lived, as I said before, for pretty much the entirety of our evolution, millions of years of hominid evolution, as hunter-gatherers, small bands of people, no more than 100, 150 or so, going out and hunting during the day, if you were a man, and gathering if you were a woman, sitting around the campfire at night, telling stories, sharing knowledge, passing on that knowledge to the next generation. In fact, a very nice way of life. We may think of it as being nasty, brutish, and short, as Thomas Hobbes referred to it, but in fact it wasn't. And people who have studied hunter-gatherer communities refer to them as the original affluent society, and that they have the ultimate gift, or the ultimate affluence, the gift of free time. In fact, it takes very little effort for hunter-gatherers to go out and make their living. They spend perhaps a few hours a day going out hunting and gathering, and they have a lot of time to develop novel technologies, sit around and tell stories, create art, whatever it might be. Of course, agricultural societies completely shifted that, and there was an incentive to work, a requirement to work. It also increased the number of people. As I said before, this had a direct effect on the disease burden, but it also had an effect on us mentally as well, I would argue. This is from a study, a very famous study done by the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar back in the early 1990s, where he looked at the so-called neocortex ratio. This is the part of the brain that allows you to process social relationships. It keeps track of your ability to recognize that person and know how they relate to you and so on. And he asked, is there any kind of a relationship between the size of the neocortex relative to the total brain size and the size of the group that people live in? There should be. A priori, you would expect it based on what we know about the physiology and the biology. So he looked at lots of ape and monkey species, and he created this curve which predicted the average group size very, very well. And if you place humans out there based on their neocortex ratio, we should be living in groups of 148, so roughly 150. And of course, today, we're not. We're living in much larger groups, crammed into cities, forced to work in places like this. Most of us, not anymore, but we certainly went through a phase where our immediate ancestors were. But this is our life for many of us today, or this. And I would argue that it takes its toll mentally on us. Even if you enjoy being in crowds, there may be things in this noisy world that we live in today, this world that's so full of stimuli, so foreign to the way we evolved for so many millions of years, you don't even recognize. A wonderful little story from the Atlantic magazine. Journalist Toby Lester, back in 1997, wrote about the sounds he heard in his office. Sounds coming from the fans in his computer and other noises in the office. He says, my office plays a curious combination of intervals. One joyous and stable, do, mi, another devilish and inimical, do, fa, sharp, and the third, mi, fa, sharp, emotionally neutral. The overall result is an ambiguous chord that at its upper end begs for resolution. Could this ambiguity and tension be one reason I so often feel on edge? So he's listening to that every day. This particular chord, the medieval Catholic Church termed the diabolus in musica, the devil in music, because it does leave you with this feeling of unease. So, just again, this idea that the world that we've created, although it has many positive benefits, I think there is some ancillary baggage as well. Now, what effect is it having on us that's measurable? This has all been very touchy-feely so far. Well, think about the drugs that are prescribed today. People have always taken drugs. You think about ayahuasca in the Amazon rainforest, or marijuana, cannabis in Africa and Asia, other drugs. People have taken drugs to get into trance-like states, to get out of the state of normal, everyday life, and to achieve transcendence, perhaps. But what's interesting is that the most prescribed drug class in the world today is not statins, to lower our cholesterol. Doctors tell us we should be worried about this. It's not the statins. It's not the antihypertensives. Everybody's, of course, worried about high blood pressure, perhaps a byproduct of the modern world. Not that. No, in fact, it's antidepressants. This is the first time in history that we are taking drugs to make ourselves feel normal. And 8% of the US population at any given point in the year is on antidepressants. Unless you think this is just a bunch of crazy Yanks who are over-medicating, 3.5% of the French population as well. 3.5% of the Canadian population in British Columbia. This is a global phenomenon, and it seems to be spreading. There's a book that came out earlier this year on the Americanization of depression and the idea that we need to be popping pills, but it does reflect a broader trend, I believe, in the decline in mental health. The WHO, in fact, estimates that by 2020, mental illness will be the second leading cause of death and disability worldwide after heart disease. And depression is going to be the major cause of that. So again, we seem to be going down this path, which was set in motion, I would argue, by the massive increases in population size and the lack of affluence in terms of free time that we once had as hunter-gatherers. Now, there is perhaps a way through this morass that we're finding ourselves in, and it can be seen in one of the most modern incarnations of technology, certainly in the last few years, the whole idea of social networking. Facebook. How many people are on Facebook? Anyone out in the audience? Yeah. Well, it turns out that nearly 500 million people are on, over 400 million. I put the slide together, but it's now up to nearly 500 million, increasing by around 10 million a month. If it were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. And with that many possible friends, God, you would think that people would have thousands of them. Some people do. But, interestingly, the average user is 130, which is pretty close to Dunbar's number. So, in all of this potential cacophony, all this potential noise, what's happening is people are creating their own hunter-gatherer band. And this may give us an insight into a way out of some of these issues that are facing us today. The final chapter is called Toward a New Mythos. And I started off with a quote from Aldous Huxley, "All gods are homemade, and it's we who pull their strings, and so give them the power to pull ours." Part of the chapter is about the rise in fundamentalism in the second half of the 20th century, which I won't go into now because I don't have time, unfortunately. But I do want to, at this point, actually read from the book to give you a sense of what the chapter is about and the ultimate resolution of some of these issues. So what you're looking at here is the hand of a good friend of mine, Julius Indaya, who's a Hadzabe hunter-gatherer. He's a chieftain in Tanzania. And I've spent a lot of time living and working with his band of hunter-gatherers in the bush. One evening back at camp, I asked Julius how the Hadzabe dealt with their dead. Burial, perhaps, or cremation? He smiled and shook his head. No, he explained, we don't bury the bodies or burn them. We leave them out in the open in a sacred place, near a baobab tree, and let the animals eat them. Usually it's the hyena. There's a small ceremony performed by the elders, and we leave food for the passage to the afterlife. We return a few months later to find the bones, and then hide them in the bush. The land we live in is full of the remains of our ancestors, and it connects us to them. The simplicity of his answer is what struck me most. The entirety of the Hadzabe's land is burial ground, with no separate place for the dead to spend their afterlives. They continue on in the landscape after they're dead, and that's part of the reason the Hadzabe feel such a close connection to their territory. Land, to the Hadzabe, is not just something that provides subsistence, though of course that's important. It's also a tangible connection with their ancestors. The land and the people are inseparable, and this connection is the essence of their mythos. To attempt to separate them or to exploit the land in some way would be an insult to the entire Hadzabe worldview. It was and is unthinkable. Many traditional cultures around the world feel such a connection to the land where they live, but perhaps none more so than the hunter-gatherer. The agriculturalist relies on favorable weather to grow his crops, but the mythos of agriculture is ultimately one of production and extraction. If I plant the seeds, tend them, protect them from pests, and harvest them, then I'll be able to feed my family. Through my labor, I change the environment into something I can control, and that allows me to grow enough food to survive. If the land ceases to be productive, I'll have to move on to find new land. For agriculturalists, the land itself is simply a conduit, a way to turn seeds into something useful. Slash and burn agriculture is simply the most egregious example of this approach to land use. The problem with such a mythos, as any environmentalist will tell you, is that it's simply not sustainable in the long run. Ultimately, the era of manifest destiny must come to an end when there's nowhere else to move. The seeds that set in motion the Neolithic Revolution have bloomed into a wholesale rush to extract and exploit most of the Earth's resources, largely because it was possible to do so, and it seemed that their supply was infinite. But as we enter the 21st century, this old mythos is becoming increasingly untenable, as we saw in the previous chapter. As resources become more limited, that scarcity challenges the old models of development and progress. Similarly, the lurch toward fundamentalism in the Islamic world and in the United States has been largely a reaction to the increasing loss of mythos. The loss of cultural traditions leaves many people feeling adrift and exploited, human mirrors of our ravaged ecosystems. Logos is great at explaining how things happen, but less helpful in providing an answer to why. Humans need such explanations to make sense of the world, and if we don't know about the science or don't buy into that worldview, we'll invoke religious or mythological explanations. Does the sun rise every day because the earth rotates on its axis, or because the gods are smiling on us and want to provide its life-giving rays? It all depends on what culture we grew up in. I'm not advocating conversion to fundamentalism any more than I'm urging us to abandon our plows and return to hunting and gathering. But I do think that the current cultural conflict should cause both sides to re-examine their underlying tenets. The modern secular West should ask what it is that fuels the flames of fundamentalism, just as the advocates of jihad should ask why such war is justified. Ultimately, fundamentalism can exist only in opposition to something else. It's a protest movement. If there were nothing to protest, it would lose its raison d'etre. What can we do to encourage such a consilience? The Scottish philosopher David Hume pointed out that is not the same as ought. Simply because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But exactly the opposite seems to be the case today. If we can do something, that seems to provide a justification for doing it. And as we learn to do more things, we want even more. A vicious cycle thriving off the illusion that resources are unlimited. This process started 60,000 years ago as our species expanded from its African homeland to populate the world, and it accelerated abruptly after the Neolithic Revolution. With agriculture, as we've seen, came the power to create far larger problems than we could have even dreamed of as hunter-gatherers, and the driving force behind most of them was greed. While we can never go back to the pre-agricultural era, we can perhaps take as a moral guide the mythos of the world's remaining hunter-gatherers. We can learn to want less. It's only by wanting less that we'll be able to come to terms with the challenges of climate change. Wanting less will also give us a better insight into how best to apply powerful technologies such as genetic engineering, by forcing us to accept that there are limits to human perfectibility. And by making a bit of room for mythos at the cultural table, we'll probably mitigate some of the extreme forms of fundamentalism. After all, it's the crass materialism and cultural imperialism of the West that's cited by so many Islamic fundamentalists as a reason for jihad. Sayyid Qutb, who's one of the major thinkers in the fundamentalist movement, developed his hatred for the modern secular Western lifestyle after living in the United States. He wrote disparagingly of its utilitarian culture dominated by materialism. Reducing the importance of such materialism wouldn't put Islamic fundamentalism out of business, of course, but one of its major justifications would be gone. Continued expansion at the rate we've seen in the past few centuries simply isn't tenable. We're currently using far more of the Earth's natural resources than will be sustainable in the long run. Even technological innovation won't create unlimited new supplies of fresh water, nor will it allow everyone to live American lifestyles. Knowing when to say no is sometimes more important than discovering a new way to say yes. Perhaps one of the few positive things to come out of the severe global recession we're experiencing as I write this is that materialism has become less important than it was in the past, and the late 20th century substitution of mythos, money for mythos, has lost some of its luster. Writers such as Bill McKibben and James Howard Kunstler have tapped into the new sense that we need to downsize our lifestyles. McKibben, alarmed at the proliferation of transhumanist technologies like genetic engineering that threaten to change the essence of what it means to be human, asks, must we ever grow and reach in power, or can we, should we, ever say enough? Kunstler, a critic of American suburbia and the author of The Geography of Nowhere, wrote in an op-ed piece in the Washington Post, no combination of solar, wind, and nuclear power, ethanol, biodiesel, tar sands, and used French fry oil will allow us to power Walmart, Disney World, and the interstate highway system, or even a fraction of these things in the future. We have to make other arrangements. These other arrangements, for Kunstler, involve changing the relationship we have with where we live and closing the door on suburban sprawl. In essence, he's telling us we need to want less. Less commuting, smaller houses, more energy-efficient forms of transportation, food that's more cottage than industry. Designers and architects are also embracing a new ethos, trying to make more intelligent use of their materials. The architect William McDonough writes of a new cradle-to-cradle approach to design, where the goal is to rethink the old models of manufacturing and building. He asks in his book, Cradle to Cradle, what would have happened if the Industrial Revolution had taken place in societies that emphasized the community over the individual, and where people believed not in a cradle-to-grave life cycle, but in reincarnation? An interesting question, and one that may very well be answered as we search for a new post-religious mythos in the secular world. It's a question into which Julius might have some insight. We're at a critical juncture, a time unlike any other in the history of our species, where our culture threatens to destroy the essence of what it means to be human. It's vital that we take lessons from our past in order to better know ourselves and to guess at where we should go tomorrow. We are in control of our own destinies, perhaps the first generation ever to have such power. But how will we know what to do? My suggestion is that some of these answers should come from Lake Eyasi, as well as Washington, Brussels, and Kyoto. On January 22, 2003, NASA received its last communication from the Pioneer 10 spacecraft. Pioneer had been launched in 1972 as the first object made by humans intended to leave the solar system. When the communication was received, Pioneer was over 7 billion miles from Earth, far beyond the orbit of Pluto, on a journey that would take it to the red star Aldebaran over the next 2 million years. It's likely that by the time it's found by extraterrestrial life forms, assuming they're out there, the Earth will have been absorbed by an expanding sun, and the world as we know it today will be but a distant memory. Attached to its outer cover, Pioneer carries a plaque as a message to other intelligent life. In addition to explaining the location of our planet in the galaxy, it shows a drawing of a man and a woman. They're naked, and the man has his hand raised in a friendly gesture of welcome. Critically, there's no writing on the plaque, no mention of countries or politicians, no descriptions of religions or material wealth. As the first hello from our species to life beyond our planet, we chose to emphasize our biological essence. Pioneer can be seen as a metaphor for the future. Its last feeble radio signal, traveling at the speed of light, took nearly 12 hours to reach Earth. This means that when we receive a signal from Pioneer in our present, it's already 12 hours ahead of us, speeding alone into the unknown depths of space. In effect, it's already begun to leave our present behind. By the time it reaches the Aldebaran system, the length of time that will have elapsed since its launch will be similar to that separating us from our ancestor Homo erectus. Human culture will have changed enormously, but we, assuming we're still around, will still be defined by our biology. There's a lesson in this. At the present critical point in human history, where we have the tools to begin to solve some of the problems set in motion by the Neolithic Revolution, saving ourselves will mean accepting human nature, not suppressing it. It will mean reassessing our cultural emphasis on expansion, acquisition, and perfectibility. It will mean learning from peoples that retain a link back to the way we lived for virtually our entire evolutionary history. And it might allow us to stick around for the next 2 million years.